All right, welcome, Professor Gregg Henriques, back to Sense Space.
Thank you. Great to be back. Sorry that I was causing some sense confusion last time on my end, but I'm glad we got it squared away, at least as of now.
Yeah, we got an onslaught of Wi-Fi interruptions, but it's good to be back. And we did manage to have a little bit of a discussion last time. So to lay an introduction, you are the professor of psychology at James Madison University. You run the combined doctoral program. Combined integrated.
Right, it's combined integrated. I ran it until 2017 for 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
Voluntarily stepped down. So, because as academics know, to run a program requires a lot of time and diligence, and I was looking to branch off. They're normally 4-year terms, so essentially it was like it was my third 4-year term, and I was like, okay, it could be good for somebody else to take the wheel here.
Yeah, maybe some fixed term limits in there. So, of course, tree of knowledge sprouting out the back of your head right now as we speak.
Right.
This
Actually, that's as confusing as it is. That's the theory of knowledge tree. The first branch on the theory of knowledge tree spouting is the tree of knowledge system.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's kind of a Moebius infinite loop kind of I got going there. So yeah, there's a lot of layers to my work, and that's one of the weird ones right up front. That's the theory of knowledge tree in the garden. The first branch is an apple upon which you eat, called the tree of knowledge system, which orients you towards science, which then aligns with good and evil.
So it's got that fractal sort of layout.
Got a fractal, exactly. Inside out, everything and nothing, all of that kind of stuff going
on. So I do want to kind of dance around the tree of knowledge to the best of my ability. It's during this conversation. But I think sort of picking up, first of all, where we left off, we were talking about you at age 28, finding yourself running this clinical research program into providing care for people who've attempted suicide under the quite intense oversight of the founder of cognitive therapy. And so, yeah, I guess I want to kind of get a sense for what it is to go into the sort of go to the front of the furnace of these interventions that you might make in a clinical context. Like, what are the sort of qualities that you bring to bear when you're dealing with people who are really sort of like on the edge?
Sure.
And yeah, I guess we'll sort of start with that.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's certainly intense work to work, I mean, I think psychotherapy can be pretty intense. If you ask individual psychotherapists, what's the most stressful thing about their job? Dealing with suicide and suicidal ideation is universally and easily identified as, oh gosh, this is anxiety provoking. So to run a project, as I did with just individuals who had attempted suicide, not even just at ideation, but actually gone through a serious act of trying to kill themselves, it was, you're dealing with people who are, getting chewed up by what we would call psych ache. That's a term in the literature. It's that deep gnawing in the soul of pain and anguish. The vast majority of people start to think, and then if the impulse takes over and they act on it, are usually oriented toward a solution, and that solution is escape. Okay? It's escape from the despair and the darkness and the anguish that they are in the moment surrounded by. And so their soul basically is, I can't tolerate this. I need nothing, and maybe nothing for eternity would be better than the anguish that I feel. In terms of a cognitive narrator, hopelessness and helplessness, and a sense that one is a burden on the planet, on oneself, on others, and that will be what just is the logic that then would then say, well, if, and indeed I certainly support this, if this was the case, that it was eternal suffering, then it makes sense to end eternal suffering, right? That would be, so there's certainly a basic logic to killing yourself. So that's an interesting space to enter into somebody. And sometimes it's a very clear case whereby, from a clinical perspective, you know, if I told you, oh my God, I just lost my job and I'm in, and then I'm drunk and I then say, well, there's no point in living, I'm going to get a rope and hang myself. I think you could say with some confidence, you'd be like, hey, wait, Greg, that might be a little impulsive. That might not be all of you across all time. So we see these instances where individuals are injured, they're fragile, they're vulnerable, and they get what Beck would call a suicidal mode of activation, which I think is a very nice term. A mode of activation is a state-based mode, meaning that there is a part of yourself that in this state feels this way. Okay? But there's lots of other parts of you that generally don't feel that way. And then you, as a therapist, you have, what will happen is that people get horse blinders on when they're in this mode, so that this becomes everything, and they lose sight of the larger time picture. Okay? And what I would try to help people, those individuals that had this kind of setup, what I help them very see that if you make the suicide decision, note that from a time perspective, God only knows what's on the other side, but we can say, well, at the very least at this life, then that's an eternal decision. Okay. So at a rational level, if we there are lots of different ways to come at suicide and try to help people frame it in ways so that they can engage in more adaptive problem solving. But ultimately, one angle is to help them expand their time horizon and realize that, hey, although today sucks and tomorrow might suck, it doesn't mean that 6 months from now will suck. Okay? But if you murder yourself, and we could talk about it often in those terms, if you decide to murder yourself, you're murdering your future self. And based on what I'm looking at, that's it seems a little less than ideal. That's a rationalist approach, and certainly the cognitive approach utilizes rational thinking. It certainly comes off of what might be called an ego psychology tradition. If you trail it from the psychodynamic traditions, it's an ego psychology. And both Aaron Beck, goes by Tim Beck, and Albert Ellis embraced certain forms of utilizing rational thought to engender one's adaptive living. And that was one angle, certainly, that we would take. At the very basic level, my job would be to enter somebody's life as a healer, okay? As a healer of some level, as a healer who knows his limitations. Okay? So I do talk therapy. So let's be clear, many of the individuals I work with live at the poverty line. They have been raped, tortured. They have been beaten by a systemic system of disadvantageous. I mean, it's about 75% were African Americans. They lived in communities and cultures that were sort of trauma torn, okay? Competitive, harsh. And I'm going to come in and have some conversations with somebody. Okay, so let's put it in perspective about what's available. And at the same time, as the Stoics were well aware, and as the Buddhists were well aware, much of suffering isn't the situation that you're in, but how you construe it, how you approach it. And the processes by which you construe and approach world can lead to dramatically different outcomes. And so there is some potential for effective healing. And many of these individuals haven't experienced much in the way of what it's like to be loved by somebody who can see their pain, and be with them in their suffering, and just bear witness to their suffering. That's a big part of the role of a healer, is to bear witness. So I would enter people's lives. I believe in the fundamental dignity of human beings. So it's not hard for me to empathize and see their struggles as trying to do the best that they can do. I think the vast majority of people are trying to do the best that they can do. And then I engage them on reflection in relation. And certainly there was a cognitive model that we used that was helpful. As I started to indicate, I thought that the cognitive therapy model was one important slice on the one hand, to give a nod to Beck. I used it, and I think that when you're talking with suicidality, very often what you're getting is impulsive dysregulation, which hijacks your cognitive thought and makes it rigid and absolute. And if you can maintain cognitive flexibility and perspective and engage in rational adaptive thinking, that is helpful. So I think that that's a lot to say. I also, as I was engaged in our conversation last time, very clear that that's one slice of a very, very complicated picture. And indeed, my argument, my experience in running the whole program was that we use lots of slices. In fact, when we first tried to do it, it didn't work. And then we had to bring in lots of things, which I would put under the social work delivery of treatment mechanisms in terms of the attitude, the structure. And I believe that that was absolutely crucial. But one of the things that was disheartening was when we revealed the study, and what gets published in the Journal of American Medical Association, is that, it's a brand promotion that was there to promote cognitive therapy. That was the research unit about, that was his mission. I don't hold that against him, but I will say that to me, in my empirical scientist side, I thought it was very, very problematic, to say the least. And it made me believe even more in the idea that we have a lot to work to do in the field of human psychology and psychotherapy to generate an adequate conceptual frame with the appropriate language to talk about what we know and what we do.
There's a lot in that, Greg. I guess what's coming for me now is, you mentioned before about, you have a kind of similar credentials as Jordan Peterson, and he certainly seems to strike a chord with a broader breakdown in meaning making.
Absolutely.
And you've just done the Untangling the World Knot 12-part, which admittedly I haven't gotten through, with John Vervaeke.
Yeah.
And he, is responding in a way to the same thing with a different flavor and a different, the ecology of practices.
That's right.
So I guess, I never found myself relating to therapy. I never went to therapy when I was going through my most difficult period. People that I did know who had experiences with therapy was mostly quite limited. And there was a feeling that something about the, in the context of the UK, mental health provision is nationalized and socialized, and it's, if somebody's going through what you described, sort of being in the pit of that, something like recursive trauma inducing a kind of reciprocal narrowing of the field of possibility, that what I've been talking with a little bit with Guy Sangstark about in regards to these experiences of like trauma and deep depression is like it's not being able to notice that you're not noticing kind of thing.
Sure.
And so the question then becomes like, how do you break out of that, sort of collapse? And I've had this experience before of like, you do something or you change up the context, or somebody you're in relationship with says something to you. It's like, oh, and then sort of the clouds clear and suddenly it's like, oh, there is actually some spaciousness available to like reassess the situation. And I guess the other thing that came up in my experience of, I guess, that move from like pre-tragic into tragic was that I felt in that sort of pre-tragic mode of not having ever really dropped into suffering myself, that the level that the cultural layer is at is somehow devoid of meaningful relationship to suffering. But then when you drop down into your own, there's this felt sense and perception that like a lot of people are suffering right now, like that that it's like really there's a lot of people on the edge or who are just keeping themselves busy to avoid the things that are bubbling under. And so I guess, that's sort of me linking it back to that collective breakdown. And what I would like to try and understand is kind of there's a future vision in this somewhere coming out of your work. And I think there's going to be a place for the bottom up, so to speak. And there has to be a place for the top down in the sense of the profession. But if we leave the mental health crisis entirely in the hands of therapists and psychiatrists and so forth, we're fucked.
Totally fucked. Yes. I'm seriously considering giving up my license as a symbol to honor that fuckedness. That's the wrong way to go. Okay. So that's a whole other. So there's a lot.
So the bottom up just being like, what happens when, I being in the situation where I didn't have the quality of relationships or the contexts that would have afforded me to communicate where I was at.
Right.
And this seems to be true for the majority of people. And so that bottom up, like organic, like how do we rebirth a culture where this is kind of what I'm envisioning is like a self-organizing, distributed resilience of some kind.
Beautiful. That's certainly resonant with my hope. Absolutely. So there's a lot there. I'll go back and disentangle some of the threads that I heard and see if we can weave them together. So yes, I have the same basic training as Jordan Peterson, in the sense that I'm trained as a clinical psychologist. I'm very interested in what the empirical version of our science says, and I have been steeped in that. I'm also a big critic of it. And so I also deeply appreciate and long for philosophical bridging with psychology and both the science of psychology. It's rich, sort of philosophical and popular elements that go into things like Freud and Jung and what the impact they have on the humanities. And I deeply appreciate Jordan Peterson's views on some of those. I also think that the Jordan Peterson phenomena is clearly diagnostic of something ailing our culture. I think that both Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke see that in different but complementary angles. They see the meaning crisis, to then use John's term. I am in some ways very interestingly placed in relationship to those two characters. You know, and can, excuse me, can see both, embrace both of them. You know, I found that that Jordan's articulation of the dark, you know, shadow, we have to come to terms with the existential fact that we are pieces of shit. Basically, this is okay. That's the existentialism in some ways. It is and certainly a psychodynamic existentialism. You were thrown into the world. You know, you have dreams and fantasies about being something other than you are. You try to manifest control over that, but you will die and be forgotten, and you are nothing in relationship to the expanse of being. That's one angle of it. And, you know, I think you gotta, and yet, as you confront that reality, you also, you know, can wake up to the fractal inverse of that and realize that you're everything. Nothing. Okay. And there's hope, and there's a journey to be one. And so Jordan does that, you know, he goes in there, he's kind of got a neurotic disposition, right? And then, you know, appreciates the darkness and climbs from there towards redemption. And John comes at it from a different angle. And what I experience very much is they're both beautiful and complementary angles. Everyone's going to find their disposition and their development and socialization processes of their unique history are going to position them in a particular unique perspective on how to struggle with existential being. I love both their struggles. I think that Jordan spoke to something about our culture at multiple levels that comes back to some of the things that you were saying. I think that he spoke to is a shallowness to it at some level. It's lost touch with the depth, even as we go through a mental health crisis. It's as though the system is like, it's okay, everything will be fine. We get you cookies and we bubble wrap you and we eliminate all the bullies and you should be happy. Just say your gratitudes 3 times a day and you'll be happy. It's like, you know, yeah, right. Good fucking luck with that. As if. And then if you're miserable, go talk to your therapist and they'll tell you how to fix it and then get a pill. You know, and then you get back there and you'll be happy again. It's like, yeah, well, I'm sorry, folks. If that's the pill you have been swallowing and you're actually a relatively deep individual and you live in a culture where you're fractured and isolated, then you'll sit in the loneliness of despair and wonder why you're not happy. You know, and that's what huge numbers of our modern culture are facing. It's a nightmare, you know. And we definitely need to do it differently. There are totally different ways to relate to this process of being human that are both richer and they embrace aspects of the suffering, but they metabolize the suffering to orient towards growth rather than despair. And that's a world of difference. So I think Jordan was speaking to some of that in his own particular way. I also feel saddened by the fact, because I think I don't know whether he certainly got pulled into the wave. I don't know how much he appreciated, but he allowed himself to then become defined by the horrific polarization in the political culture war that we live in, especially over here in North America. I mean, I live in the States. It's unbelievable and it's toxic. And he both got attention for that, which you know, it's good to have influence. And Jordan Peterson gets about, you know, is the most influential intellectual from 2018 to 2019 on the planet. So that's a huge amount of attention. But it's also the case with that he got then defined and became a part of the stain of dichotomized polarization, which then is going to ruin. It's a cancer, and because it's a cancer, then it ruins the message. It then has to be seen through the lens of what it is politically. Makes it a phenomenon, but it also makes it toxic. So that was sad to me. I think that he had a lot of brilliant things to offer, and he's coming back. So, you know, and I felt so bad for the horror that he went through as a human being. It sounded like absolute hell last year. I think John's version, the cognitive science, ecology of practice, the transformation of a new axial age, a new enlightenment 2.0, I just find that to be beautiful. It's enormously consistent with the religion that's not a religion that I put up on my wall. I think there is a real opportunity here for us as a collective to see some potentials, some new ways of being, learn from each other, be in it together, create, Jordan, Paul, and I just yesterday or Wednesday, we're talking about a wisdom commons of sorts, create a relational space to cultivate a wisdom commons. And if we're able to do that, man, the possibility of changing the trajectory of the meaning and mental health crisis towards something that allows people to actually feel fulfilled and have mattering and be honest about the situation we are in. That'd be beautiful as far as I'm concerned.
I love that idea of a wisdom commons. Yeah, I remember hearing John talk about a wisdom wiki in dialogue with I forgot what it was in dialogue with. It might have been the ecology of praxis.
Yeah,
but
certainly his whole dialogue is to create a relational space, gain knowledge, and my whole thing is how do we obtain knowledge and transform it into wisdom? That's the unified theory of knowledge, the overarching system. My whole story starts with what would be a wise way of living in this world psychologically. I'm a clinician, so it's like that's what, to me, that's what a good clinician is like. They have some idea of a wise way of adaptively living in the world. Now, I will tell you that actually clinicians don't generally get trained this way, or too many of them. And you mentioned about the Great Britain, it gets publicized, it gets public health, and and we need that. We need a health profession. But what actually happens to it is then it potentially gets co-opted by medicine. Okay, because certainly in the United States, if the system gets co-opted by medicine, are the big dogs, and everything's about institutional power. What does medicine treat? It treats diseases/disorders that are medical. It does not treat problems in living. Okay? So the entire institution of medicine, which controls the health organization regulation, is defined by treating medical disorders, not problems in living. That's what its mission is. It wouldn't treat problems in living. Like if you had a fight with your girlfriend or partner, I wasn't sure about that, partner, but anyway, that's not medicine, okay? But of course, if you have chronic fights with your partner based on your neurotic insecurities and you ruin that relationship as a function of that, well, what the hell is that? Okay, well, obviously I know what that is. That's a maladaptive identity relational emotional pattern, okay? And that's what I treat. But psychiatry and medicine doesn't know how to call that anything. So they call it a DSM disorder, right? And then in order to get reimbursed, we have to say that you're sick at some level and that medicine is here to treat you, okay? And then we build interventions that have diagnoses around particular things. So we're gonna fix your cognition in the same way we would fix your kidneys if you were a diabetic. It's just such bullshit. I can't even speak to it. It's a nightmare.
It's a disaster.
No, it's a complete disaster.
I mean, I'm sure you've heard the stories as much as I have, but just like people I know with pretty severe, complex issues going to like a psychiatrist in the United States, and my friend's telling me he's sitting in the waiting room, and every 15 minutes that each person's going in and coming out. Goes in, the guy has like a checkboard, asks him
an algorithm
questions, and then prescribes him a powerful antidepressant.
It's beyond the pale of it's the disease pill model of our struggles is one of the great catastrophes of the back half of the 20th century. That's 100% catastrophe. Okay. And there is the absolute fact of the matter is I mean, we look around, we have more physical and medical control than we've ever had, and we're more miserable than we've ever been. Hello. Okay. Maybe we're doing it wrong. And in fact, actually, when you know what the story is, you know why we're doing it wrong, Jacob. Enlightenment had no model for mind. The Enlightenment had no model for the mind. Okay, the entire Enlightenment has a grammar of matter in motion. That's the entire Enlightenment, all right? At least the scientific side of that, okay? So then we build institutions around foundational knowledge, which we do have about Newtonian classic mechanics. Yep, we got good knowledge about that. But then people convince themselves, well, right beneath that is quantum mechanics and general relativity, and then underneath that's a theory of everything. Yeah, right, like this conversation, as if, okay? It's not a theory of everything. Okay? You don't even know what knowledge is, you physicists. It's absurd. Okay? Believe me, physics is better being knowledge. Okay? So if you don't know what knowledge is, you don't have a theory of everything. Trust me. So we ground ourselves in a physical reductionism. Hell, they have eliminative materialists who think that they can reduce this conversation to brain patterns. I mean, oh my God, how confused can you possibly be? And you wonder why everyday people are sort of wandering around going, Jesus, I have a lot, I should be happy, but I feel empty inside, and I have no idea how to talk about it, and I don't know what's going on. And then you go to the medical secular priest, and they reduce it to chemistry and hand you an effing pill, and you wonder why we're all sick. I mean, seriously, give it up.
Yeah, medical secular priest. That's an interesting turn of phrase, because there's something that kind of been coming up a lot with like Paul van der Klay's discussions about the sort of, I mean, obviously the death of God, and then the disintegration of Christianity as the organizing substrate. The role of the pastor or the priest is no more.
Right.
Then we have the doctor, and then kind of sort of coming in adjacent to that, the psychologist and the psychiatrist, and then this relationship to authority. I guess there's something fundamental about being able to, confession has been a centuries old aspect of the church. There's something about being able to speak the truth of your life to someone, which people are quite deprived of.
Totally. I mean, you come to see me in my philosophy, and you say, oh my God, my life's going to hell. I'm shut down. I feel like shit. I think I'm really depressed. I say, well, how depressed do you want to be given how shitty your life is? Okay. And then everyone's like, what are you talking about? Basically, I mean, like, what are you talking about? How depressed do I want to be? It's like, well, yeah, obviously, if your life is fucking shitty, I'd be depressed as hell. Okay. Notice how unbelievably different that is. It basically validates the negative affect and shutdown at some level, and you better do that. Okay, rather than just saying, oh, I'm just going to get a measure of how. I worked with somebody who lived underneath a bridge, had been completely raped and tortured much of her life, okay, was completely addicted to heroin, and gave blowjobs to homeless men for $5 to get her next heroin. You're telling me that the fact that she scored high on a depression thing is something wrong with the chemicals in her brain? There may have been something wrong with the chemicals in her brain, but it's depression. Okay? I mean, it's just the whole system is broken because it doesn't know what symptoms are, it doesn't know what causes are, it doesn't know what treatments are. It's just sick. And Paul van der Klee is absolutely right. We absolutely built institutions of religion to create social community functions of the commons where we spread agape, love each other, and have God love us, and now obviously the metaphysics of all that, as John and I will certainly say, is from naturalist perspective, remember the concrete literal version of that is basically for the children, and the world's a hell of a lot more complicated. And one of our horrors also of our, hey, 50% of my neighbors, I live in rural Virginia, 50% of my neighbors think that the literal version of the Bible is true. So much so that when they teach evolution to my kids, they're like, well, this is a theory. If there's anything we know scientifically, certainly better than any theories we have in psychology, it's that this is the facts. I mean, the fact of evolution. But no, we can't tread on people's religious beliefs because they got so upset Puritan systems got so upset in the heels of the modern science revolution, we had no idea actually how to make sense out of things. So we then bracket it off and say, here's your religion. Now you can believe whatever you want in the name of religion, even if it's completely like believing in Santa Claus. Okay, it's just and now we have this huge issue of like, well, what, you know. So ultimately, we have to find the Paul Vanderklay to John Vervaeke bridge, right? And be like, and Jordan Peterson, actually, there's an enormous metaphorical wisdom, an intuitive social metaphorical wisdom in things like the garden and the tree and our redemption, okay? And for the kids, we can maybe say, but as long as the rest of us know, actually, obviously, that's Santa Claus bullshit at any concrete level, right? You know, we don't know what God is. But the whole point of it is, my whole quest was, hey, does science actually tell us how to inform us to be in relation in a wise way? And I had this intuition that it did. It was a silly intuition. Turned out to be right. It was, in retrospect, an unbelievably silly intuition. I got damn lucky it was correct.
So something in your book, which I was reading some of during this week, afforded by the Wi-Fi interruptions on Monday.
Yeah. Right, my 2011 New Unified Theory of Psychology book.
You were pretty early. When I was reading it, I thought this book must have been written later, because some of the language in there, particularly when you were talking about the need for a renewal of a kind of myth, like a myth making in relationship to why you chose the Tree of Knowledge title, and also in relationship to the idea of a meta culture, which, you know, for most people in the meta tribe space has really been something that's popped up in the last year. So perhaps you could speak a little bit to, like, I mean, were you kind of on your own in that assessment at that time, and like even playing with those words?
Yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of friends and a lot of colleagues and a lot of people that I'm very fond of. My intellectual work is a journey on its own, definitely. And, you know, it starts in, you know, by 28, when I went to Beck, it was the year prior to that, 1997, that, you know, I don't know if your audience is familiar, you think we're familiar with enough the Tree of Knowledge. If not, I should probably at least flash it on here. Would that be helpful, do you think, to at least for me to share a depiction of the Tree of Knowledge?
Please, yeah. And also, if anybody wants to unpack further after this, I think your 4-part Stoa series is a good starting.
Yeah, and I could send links. I've now started my TOK21 YouTube channel. It's got all my stuff on it, even videos and all that stuff. So if you let me share my screen, I'll at least put the Tree of Knowledge real fast.
Okay, you should be able to share now.
Great. Okay. So just so we're on the same page, okay, this is a Tree of Knowledge system that actually came to me. I was stoned one night in 1997. Okay, I'd been thinking a lot, so it didn't just happen. I was working very hard and had developed actually an evolutionary model for what it was that turned us from complicated cooperative social primates into modern cultured persons. Okay, and I realized that everyone thinks about it in terms of language. That's important, but language, it needs, what's the structure and function of our linguistic thought? And it turns out that the structure and function of our linguistic thought is systems of justification systems theory. And it is that really gives you the structure function of propositional knowing. And it is the structure and function of propositional knowing that puts a human person mind on top of our animal minds. And it creates the evolution of culture, capital C culture, which are the shared systems of justification. That's why you and I can, having never met each other, can connect to each other and have a shared set of systems of justification. Knowing you very little time, where I've known my dog much longer, my dog and I never discuss whether or not this is a justifiable representation of the universe. Okay, it's just a totally different plane of existence. And it's language, propositional, meaning-making, systemic based, and then it connects human minds together in a socially constructed intersubjective space. So that's what I was working on. But the point of it is that if you cleave and get very clear about a unified framework, a theory about what turns us from primates into persons, and you cleave that, which, by the way, people don't have. Okay, like nobody has a theory of why exactly. People have ideas. People don't have precise theories. I was deep into this, and I developed an idea and was working on it for 6 to 8 months. And then, so that's the first gigantic jump I made. And that was going to be my whole life. It's like, oh my God, I'm so glad, that I had one great idea. It's an unbelievably important idea. It's what is it makes us human? Okay, human persons. All right, it's really, that's the key. It's what makes us as persons. And what explains what human culture to be so radically different, and why over the last 50,000 years it's been on this accelerating change curve, okay? And makes us so different. If you listen to Daniel Schmachtenberger, it's not like we're an apex predator, it's like we're a different kind of being. And the issue is because of cultural evolution, okay? Because culture then allowed for technological evolution, technological and cultural evolution together allows us to just dominate the planet in radically different ways, and we're really in the midst of a huge flux right now. Okay, so with that, all right, I had carved a joint point between the animal mind, okay, and the culture person. And with that joint point, then these other layers just popped out of my head, and then that spun me off on a radically different view of the world. Okay? And it's radically different in the sense that I've shared this with so many. I sent it to Dan Dennett. So in like 1999, I'm like this young postdoc, okay, getting there are all these icons, right, of what I would now call modern Blue Church icons, right? Dan Dennett, Steve Pinker, E.O. Wilson, Richard Dawkins, and I was like, oh, I figured this out, and I'm going to go and try to get knighted by these guys. That's what I tried to do. Like I sent this to Dan Dennett. He wrote back a one-word email that says, well, Greg, I have one word for you, unsurprising. That's what Dan Dennett says, okay? Unsurprising, all right? Like, well, Dan, like, okay, that's unsurprising. You already know all that, right? It's so funny in retrospect, but I mean, I was disheartened. I wrote a 3-page reply as to why it wasn't, but the fact of the matter is that there's just a particular layered structure of insight, okay, that the intelligentsia thinks it already knows because it already has explored this. I mean, this is common sense in many ways, okay? But then there's a whole nother layer behind it that's unbelievably transformational, all right? And the systems, the blue churches, were at institutional justificatory inertia in ways that they were just going to process that at the level upon which they could process it. So Dan Dennett's mind looks at it as like, oh, I know this already, AKA unsurprising, okay? I'm on the outside of that, like going, Dan, I'm behind you, not in front of you, right? It's like back here, all right? But the institutional structures are not in any place upon which they can operate because it's foundational. When the foundations are shifted, when you're on the mirror image on the outside, right? Then if you have established yourself on the inside of the worldview, okay, and then climb to the top, the foundations you're set in, you're fixed. We call that fixed belief. And the idea that you want to melt those and then unfreeze them and try to regrow as a middle-aged, expert, it's no way. Okay, that's not what people want to do. So I learned that the hard way, because I'm like, hey, I thought we were all interested in this truth thing. I thought that's what the Academy was out. It sort of is, but it's truth in accordance with its institutional commitments and contingencies. It's contingent truth as long as it's ready to metabolize the food it can digest so the people in power get what they want. Okay? Because it will not, it's not gonna digest a piece of food that ultimately turns it inside out and then reveals itself to a lot of the foundations that it built itself on are now need to be superseded, undone. It's not going to eat something that does that to it. So it just spits it out. So, that's what it does. But as one person who's following their soul, hell, I do my day job and then I do my night job. And you asked, it's sort of prescient. Yeah, because after I did that, I knew that the 21st century was going to be unbelievable within 6 months. I saw this whole thing at the level, and no specifics. And the reason it's not magic, okay? It's just logic. Why? So it says, if you listen to pay attention seriously to the diagram, okay? What is life? What is life? Life on the diagram is a superordinate emergent plane of existence, okay? Meaning that it's a complex adaptive plane that's operating above, okay, and within, but also above the material plane.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, it's both within and above. That's kind of funky. That's what makes it kind of hard to say, well, what is it? It's not that complicated. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
For example, like every sentence we have, every sentence you utter has a meaning, the propositional meaning of the sentence. It exists both within the set of all possible letters. Okay, so if we spell it out, this sentence has meaning, okay, exists within the set of all possible letters, and yet the meaning is not found in the letters, it resides above the letters. Okay, all right, so in fact, the words can be thought of, and then they get yoked together, and then you have an informational unit of meaning that exists within the set of all possible letters, but resides as an informational unit above the letters. Okay, cells work that way. In other words, they exist as the set of all possible molecular combinations, but they operate in dynamic informational energy processing relations to be unique higher order systems. Okay. So how do they do that? Well, it's the yoking together of information within the cell, right, and then communication between cells that generates a new complex adaptive plane of existence. And John talks about all this all the time. Autopoietic, it's complex adaptive systems theory. These are all now basic. The complexity people had to come along, Jordan Hall and Santa Fe, Jim Rutt, and all those, they had to fill in why these things are, what are the, really, I would argue, they're really backfilling in proper metaphysics to talk about like what a cell is that's different from a molecule. But the key that I wanted to emphasize here is that what is the logical ingredient? Information processing, communication. Information within, communication between, great, okay? You jump up to mind, you see the exact same damn thing, okay? It's the neuro-information processing. John's brilliant recursive relevance realization is the neurocognitive. It takes you, what do we mean by neuroinformation processing? Oh, it's stacked relevance realization across scale. That's unbelievably brilliant insight, okay? But that's the information processing within, and of course, then we're gonna share stuff and be in between animals. So that's what I would just call communication, but basically it's, it's whatever's within and between, okay? And then you get animals. We go from jellyfish before the Cambrian explosion, okay? Mm-hmm. Which are distributed neural nets, all right? They're sort of like plants, okay? They're not really, they do not have what I would call a mind at that stage. Jellyfish don't. They're right at the base. You get distributed neural nets. The Cambrian explosion sees the emergence over a 10 to 30 million year period, what in geologic time is a blip. Of course, in human time, it's infinitely long, 30 million years, but whatever. Anyway, that you get a jump, but by the end of it, so what's in a fairly short period of time, we go from very, very weak, to all of a sudden seeing a landscape of animals that look like crabs almost, okay? Which means they have complex active bodies. They're in competition with each other. They're preying and predation on each other. And then you get this whole emergence. And I also believe that what you really get there is the emergence of what John and I landed on, valence qualia. In other words, valence qualia is your pleasure and pain signal, okay, nature signal for guiding the system as a whole. That's really the base of mind, the subconscious, the subjective mind. And I think it comes along with the brain fairly early. The intuitive broadcasting sense of pleasure and pain, not the perspectival. okay? Not full perspectival knowledge. I think that does come online with the cortex, and you get it in birds and mammals, maybe octopuses, anyway. So then you get this explosion, though. The whole point is that you have a distributed neural net, okay? And in information processing, you get that explosion. That's mind. And whenever I say mind, then with a capital M here, that's animal mind. And you don't have to, it's not a mystery. You can't have to like, hey, can I see mind? You walk your dog, you play fetch with your dog, you're witnessing mind in my definition, okay? Animal behavior. Then you get up, then we start talking, and we justify, and then humans, okay? Which means we're engaged in another kind of information processing, a language acquisition device on the left hemisphere, all right? Can comprehend and produce language inside the skull, my internal narrator, I talk to myself, and I can talk with you. Now, in between, communication between, okay? Each one of those, each layer then, within the cell, between the cells, within the animal, between the animal, within person, between persons, each one of them is novel information processing communication, okay? So then once you see that pattern and you're like, oh, so in other words, these complex adaptive landscapes operate as a function of information processing communication networks, especially if there's a complex adaptive feedback loop that coordinates them. Okay? So then you look at the 20th century and you simply ask, well, hey, is it possible that through our interface with technology, we started laying down a novel kind of information processing and communication system? So the 20th century is the jellyfish stage, right? The 21st century is Cambrian explosion. Okay? And then we're gonna start networking with this artificial intelligence system, and we're gonna create a digital virtual landscape. And God only knows what that looks like, but it is gonna be a game changer. That's one thing the Tree of Knowledge tells you in 1997. I'm like, oh my God, the 21st century is a game changer, and everything, the modernity systems that we have in place are gonna radically transform. So I knew that 23 years ago.
That was an awesome journey up the evolutionary tree. I'm going to have to do a little complex riff because there were so many little things that came up for me. First of all, this great idea came to you when you were stoned, which I totally resonate with because many of my best shifts into kind of lateral thinking and insights have come in relationship to cannabis, which I think it's important.
It's a lifelong practice for me. My kids growing up, oh, what are those funny cigarettes Dad smokes on Friday and Saturday night? It's Dad's work. Dad's doing his work. You know, like that's what I would have to. Of course, it's now, thankfully, finally, we're waking up and getting insane over here. Like you can actually do this without getting thrown in jail. But anyway, yep. No, it's for me, and I know exactly why. Essentially, what happens with cannabis in my weed mind, okay, is this, to understand creativity and the process of actual generation, you need variation, selection, and retention. It's an evolutionary process. Okay? So my normal Gregg state, it operates kind of the cop of the frontal lobe. Okay, it's a cop function. It's sort of saying, hey, okay, is this idea, what's the loose association of this idea? When you're dreaming, by the way, your cop mode goes. That's why all sorts of weird associations are happening. And you don't, unless you're a lucid dreamer, you don't wake up and go, oh, that didn't make any sense. I must be dreaming. Okay, now some people have that capacity. My dream system's generally just is operating. So all of a sudden I can be talking to you and then I'm on the beach. The next scene, and I don't say, how the fuck did that happen? I'm just on the beach. But when you're waking, we have an online system that's tracking surprise, and it's regulating, and it's deciding kind of what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And so it will clamp down the process of what gets replicated, okay? And so then you get stoned. What happens when you get stoned is you shift, well, at least if you have the creative euphoric orientation. Not everybody does. Some people have the more mellow, and they even divide up, weed lineages. They divide them up into two big classes and all that other stuff. I think it's really basically people that have two different responses more than two big weed classes. But anyway, I have the creative euphoric, okay? What does that mean? It jolts some adrenaline to me. It puts me in a hypomanic state where I feel very confident and creative. And it spreads the variation of thought, okay, high. So it makes looser associations. So now, oh, I can do this association. And it puts the cop to the side and it's like, oh my God, this is really brilliant. So I have a lot of many, many more ideas. I'm much more likely to see more ideas and see them as brilliant, okay? Now, it's the case that in the next day, when COP is back online, there's a lot of shit that what I call Meta-Gregg produces, you know, oh my God, I thought this was so cool. It's like, this is so old. You know, this is not very helpful, right? You thought it was Meta-Gregg, so I mean, I literally have, I cultivate, it's not like I have dual personalities, but I mean, essentially I have dual mind states, okay? And so Meta-Gregg will explore, okay, the associations and so my system is during the week making all sorts of different offline associations. Bring Meta-Gregg on with some weed, pop him up, start pulling all the excitement of what it is that's potentially learned, write down all the new gems that emerge in relation, okay? Do that for 2 hours, then drop, you know, then eat and go to bed. Okay. Then wake up with the cop and then basically sift through for the diamonds in the rough relation. I mean, I've been doing that for 25 years.
I'm loving this Meta-Gregg. I'm wondering.
I'll introduce him to you one day.
Yeah, we'll do it on the next episode.
There it is. Right. You can invite Meta-Gregg, and then we can decide whether I'm coming back or somebody else is.
I really need to pee. Is it okay if I just jump out and then I'll hold my thought in place and I'll be like,
actually, I'll join you.
All right, perfect. All right.
All right. Good to always get a little break in, move around.
Yeah. So there's something about the nature of insight, something quite fundamental that I'm kind of feeling out in both the way that you arrived at the theory of knowledge and the visual structure of it.
Right. Actually, let me pause you there because I do confusing things. Okay?
Please.
It's good to know the history. So my first insight's justification. That's like, okay, I'm going to separate the human person from the primate. That's the first insight. Okay. And then in that moment, I developed the tree of knowledge, or then in 1997, I developed the tree of knowledge system. Okay. The tree of knowledge system over time first says, hey, this is a way to then solve the problem of scientific psychology with a unified conceptual field. So that becomes the unified theory of psychology. All right. Then I return to the original problem, and that's up to 2011. So the book you read is here is the tree of knowledge into the unified theory of psychology. And then from 2011 to 2016, I returned to the original problem and put the foundations in place for the unified approach to psychotherapy. Okay, there's a unified approach to psychotherapy. So that's what my original issue was. Okay, and there were 4 ideas that generated the unified theory. The tree of knowledge system is one, justification, and a thing called behavioral investment theory and the influence matrix. Those 4 ideas. They then set up what becomes the unified approach, okay, which has 4 ideas on it also. Character adaptation systems, the wheel of development, the nested model of well-being, and the COM-MO approach to psychological mindfulness. Okay? Those things get synthesized together into a metaphysical empirical system of knowledge. That metaphysical empirical system of knowledge is called the unified theory of knowledge. Okay? And it is that's the tree back there. Okay? Mm-hmm. So there's 4 figures over here, 4 here, and then that yellow flower in the middle is the metaphysical empirical yoke. So the theory of knowledge is this hand thing. Okay, that's the theory. the first branch on the theory is the tree of knowledge system, the thing we just went through. Okay, so there's a fundamental difference. This then is the theory of knowledge that gets us into the cultivation of wisdom. The tree of knowledge solves the problem of what is science in a way that solves the problem of scientific psychology. Okay, and then you cultivate that into knowledge that then can be metabolized and oriented toward wisdom. Right? So the theory of knowledge is really theory of knowledge about how to obtain knowledge and transform it into wisdom. And that happened in 2017. So in 2017, it's a 20-year difference between the tree of knowledge system and what then grows into the theory of knowledge and ultimately the wisdom garden. It's a 20-year project. Okay, so those are the two parts of, if there are two huge chapters, it's justification into tree of knowledge, that chapter. And then 2017, a theory of knowledge into wisdom. Okay, that's a totally, and so that's basically, and that's to return to the garden. So it's out of the tree of knowledge and then back into Eden.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, and I tell people, listen, it's a language, okay? So what I mean by that, it's a language, is like, hey, some people will apologize. I'm not sure I'm getting it all. It's like, if I called somebody up and said, hey, I'm gonna have a 2-hour conversation, I don't speak a word of French, but I wanna speak French fluently after this conversation, you'd be like, no. It's like, no, that's not the way it works, right? So this is a multi-layered knowledge system. My doc students learned to speak it adequately after 4 years.
Wow. Oh, wow. So there's something about that, both within and above, that you spoke about, that was kind of characteristic of each of these phase shifting movements in evolution. And something then about insight, that it is both there's some sense in which we can attain more and more knowledge during the course of our lives, but then wisdom has this property that's more like coming more into what's already present. Nice. Sort of going down and in. And this is something I want to get at that's kind of one of my stoner ideas, drawing on Terence McKenna.
Okay. I'm loving it already. I like that.
So the depth of fragmentation that you identify within the field of psychology, and that I, in my understanding of the landscape of trauma and in relationship to John's kind of stacking of the meaning crisis, there are all of these layers of fragmentation, which no longer allow for the way of being of human beings or the systems to correspond with the underlying complexity, which is actually growing, which we're in relationship to. And so there was this brilliant modeling that Terence McKenna proposed, which was that during the Renaissance, there was this breakdown of the sense making of the time. And so they had to drop back down to the level of the classical civilizations, the Greeks and the Romans, and became very interested in that, and then kind of rebooted and found some tools that were appropriate for a new context and a new circumstance.
Yes.
Now, what Terence McKenna said of our moment, and this was also quite prescient because he was, back in the 80s and 90s, he suggested that the move of the 21st century would be going far deeper down and back. And so this is where it connects with cannabis in the sense of dropping into the body, but more deeply with psychedelics. And it's an idea that there is wisdom and intelligibility or intelligence within our bodies that is available to us. And that rather than dropping back 3,000 years to the Greeks, we're dropping back to prior to that 12,000 years ago agricultural circumstance, to the more nomadic, shamanic, and in relationship to nature kind of layers. And this is really beautiful to play with. And I think it's very important that both in relationship to Christianity and other mythic substrates, that we kind of go back to the mythic substrate and replay with it in a new and more complex way. And so you did this in your book 9 years ago, where you went and you talked about why you chose the tree of knowledge in relationship to Eden. And that there was, and I totally had this idea when I was like a new atheist teenager. I was like, that's so fucked. Like, them attaining knowledge and more consciousness was the sinful misdirection that caused the expulsion from the garden. But since that time, and also drawing on McKenna, I've gotten this notion that, okay, what happens in that story of Eden is the forbidden fruit is condemned, and it's associated with the snake, the serpent. The serpent is a primordial evolutionary signal for tree-dwelling primates of something you want to be not getting near to, right? So if I'm the priest of that post-agricultural civilization, and I want to say, don't do that thing, I'm going to put the snake in there. So I think that part of the lie at the heart of the Eden, or the misleading thing at the heart of Eden, is that the forbidden fruit could be considered to be psychedelic plants. The consumption of psychedelic plants in the context of McKenna's stoned ape theory is one of the plausible explanations for the massive increase in the size of the human brain and the development of language. It's not scientific, but hey, it's all pretty murky back there. But what it does is the opposite of what the story tells us. The story tells us if we just stayed ignorant in the context of Eden, then we could have stayed there. But because we chose to imbibe the fruit, we were expelled. My proposal is the right imbibing of the fruit, be that of, wisdom or of psychedelics in the appropriate context, integrated into our contemporary culture, that actually brings us back in relationship to being in a much deeper, more fundamental way, because it triggers the dropping down into the body. It triggers deep nature relatedness. And if you look at the studies at Imperial College London and Johns Hopkins, this is a fucking revolutionary thing for getting past the limitations of talk therapy. And, I've been in relationships. I was in relationship with someone who had a lot of trauma, went to talk therapy, and there just was no hope in hell of like opening up and getting down to this really deep, fundamental, somatically stored stuff. in the context of, seeing this positional authority person every couple of weeks.
Yep.
So there's a lot of pieces I just threw out there. And the other piece, I guess I'll just put them all out and see what you do with them.
Put them all out there. Hold on one sec. Hey guys. Thanks. Go ahead.
So this Dialogos journey that's been going on since like January of this year when Chris and John and everybody started it.
Yep.
I've been on it. And where I was a year ago, where I was in January, was in a place of dropping in and out of like a backlog of somatic trauma and, being in an existentially depressed state. And so for me, the primary research was like, what works to find what's meaningful to me in the context of finding it incredibly difficult to find meaning at all. And these Dialogos conversations did that for me. And that's just, and it's fucking awesome that I'm now like talking to the people who, were meaningful to me at that time. But now I'm participating in a male specific trauma group, which is not dissimilar to other kinds of men's groups. And what I'm observing is that the modality of dialogue occurring is somehow very, very similar to the modality within the Dialogos squad.
Totally.
And it's not occurring with the same kind of expert philosophical language and so forth. But there's something about that, like rhythmic dropping into the body, presencing the somatic coordination that occurs, and then this like collective mind thing that emerges, this campfire collective mind, which I think could actually be the future of mental health as well, when we're talking about that bottom-up distributed aspect.
Totally. Yep. Beautiful. So yeah, lots of things to pull on there. So if we start with the end comment, let me just say that's right. In terms of, so when I first heard Guy Henriques talk about circling, I was like, oh, you mean humanistic therapy? Okay. So circling.
Could you increase your mic or get your mic a little closer?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when I was when I first heard, although and my snapshot for listening to Guy Henriques' discussion of circling is, well, that's humanistic therapy. Okay. So and although it's not exactly and has different, humanistic therapy creates a space of authenticity, okay, and empathy. Those are the, in other words, take your preconceived judgments about what needs to be, own them, put them aside, hone in on the person's core affective experience of being, track it for its organismic valuing process, and see what their true self is down here into their social self, and try to get aligned so that they are speaking through, okay, with alignment and authenticity, as opposed to, well, what does this guy want me to hear? What are you going to actually judge? Am I going to look like an ass? Okay, is this okay? How do I feel about this shit? Okay, so we have constant interfaces between what our heart is signaling, what our private narrator is like judging, and what we're anticipating in the public sphere. Okay, and then and what humanistic therapy fundamentally is about is trying to create a space that allows for the flow, authentic relational flow, vertically, in other words, from my head to my heart and into my body, and horizontally, me to you and back again. Okay. In fact, that's what Dialogos basically identifies, the inner vertical, outer horizontal dialogue. You get resonance. When people drop into resonance, the ecosystem of justification of what's proper and what's tactful and what is okay to say gets pushed, okay? and it takes a seat at the door, and then you actually get authentic spaces for being, right? Which then provides the opportunity for coherent integration across levels and between people. And if you find that, you realize, holy shit, what have I been missing? Okay. So that's absolutely, we need to figure out how to teach. We need to figure out plant seeds and have that happen. Because that's a fundamentally, and our culture is clueless on that. You know, do that first. Don't take a pill. Find out how to relate to self and other, for the love of God. Right? Okay. So, and then you go, you know, so that's one piece. And now I work back from what you were saying in relation, you know, in terms of, yeah, how do we get in touch? And the psychedelic revolution, thank God for it. Okay. Although be wary, all right, this is not, you know, people, another thing I teach my doc students regularly, okay, is people want, okay, their problems to be complicated so that they can then take recipes. Complicated problems are algorithmic, do X, Y, and Z, and then you'll get to the end of your procedural algorithm and then you'll be happy, okay? People, and both empiricists, empirical psychologists, and, all right, regular people want our mental health problems to be complicated so they can do X, Y, and Z. I want to take a pill, I want to take a psychedelic, okay? Then I'll be okay. Oh, you just do this. Now my pain goes away and everybody says you should be happy, then I can be free to be happy, okay? What the humanistic philosophical psychologists know, right, is it isn't complicated. Now we'll put it in, it's complex, adaptive, multifaceted, up and down journey that has not really a destination per se, although you can hone yourself into wise ways of being. And you can see it across developmental. So I can look at myself today and be like, hey, 2 years ago I was operating well, but I'm operating better today. Okay, because with stage retrospection, I can be like, oh, I know, here's my edge on the ego that I had 2 years ago. I had an edge still, I know, much of my life has been culling and relating to the ego in a particular way. And maybe in 5 years, I'll look back and see where I am. Although I feel like I smoothed out the ego in the last 2 years. Of course, I would have said that 2 years ago, so we'll see. But I've definitely figured out another edge on my ego for a whole host of complicated reasons. I went through a little mini dark night of the soul, as people close to me know, basically 13 months ago. So it's a, you know, it's not a destination. Okay, you're an unfolding wave that has state fluctuations, situation fluctuations, and you die. So that's the ultimate destination, death. Okay? So be aware of that, and that's going to suck. Okay. So, I mean, it's just a lot of ways of presidency. So what the psychedelic systems do, okay, is they potentially provide a way for a different kind of ego dissolution. All right. So you take psychedelics, you drop into mushrooms or whatever it is, right? Psilocybin, the mushrooms, psychedelics, and they grab a grip of your phenomenological, and by this I mean really the perspectival into participatory world, to use John's language. You know, and use Ian McGilchrist, right hemisphere gestalt of the framing of the world rather than the particular. It's a gestalt framing. That's what your right hemisphere does. You take psychedelics in the right place, and all of a sudden you melt that relation. Okay. And if you have a bad trip, you melt it into hell, all right, which basically it melts, and then you like see stuff, and then you're trying to cling to stuff, and you want it to be a particular way, and then you'll live the dark visions of the demons, okay? And if you're still trapped in your ego in a particular way, you'll interpret them as real, and you'll have a bad trip, and that's scary and bad news. Hey, sorry. Now, for lots of people, what we see in some of these studies is some of the data are unbelievable, okay? Always remember when the studies first come out and everybody gets excited, the effect sizes are going to be way bigger than the real life effect sizes, okay?
Why is
always
that?
The way it works. There are a whole host of different reasons as to why that is, okay? But there are all sorts of reasons why. Don't buy the initial hype. It never is as good as it says. For a whole host of there are many, many reasons I could get into. But let me just tell you, there are thousands of them. Okay, and that's not to say it's not potentially valuable, but what it will never be, oh, here, this improves weight loss by 25%, and then the populace takes it and it ends up being 50%. That's not the way it works. Okay? There's always a regression back to mean with almost no exception. So always anticipate it not being as good as when it's released. The real world effect will be regression to the mean almost always. Okay? So keep that in mind and know the principles that you're operating with here. So what are the principles that are operating? You want to set people up for a particular religious experience. And by religious, I mean sacred. Okay? You want to set them up so that they understand the grip that they have, their intuitive grip in relationship to the world is then potentially transformed. Okay? So you want to prep them, you want to get that idea, you want to be open, you want to have enough safety constraints and rites of passages set up so that this becomes a major domain. And then you want the right kind of 12-hour environment for if you're doing mushrooms, 24 hours probably, to at least attend if you're doing acid. And then you want somebody to be sane and grounded, who knows this process. So if you start tipping off into the OSA, you got to get back in. And then you want to have enough variation and enough potential to do individual and group potential exploration. And then see what patterns, perceptual participatory patterns emerge that the intuitive pattern finding the self latches onto. Okay? And then if that happens, and if it feels right, the trip will be a good one and it will be transformative in that way. You'll then have that moment of seeing the world, oneself in relationship to the world, past, future, the whole thing differently. And then you'll have an insight awakening experience. Okay? Then you come down, hopefully. And then that's a state experience. Okay, states means you do not stay in an ecstatic. Will lock you up if you stay in that state. you don't want to stay in that state. All right, that's a one-time insight, and then you metabolize, consolidate, and cohere and integrate around as your police frontal lobe, or whomever I'm talking to, as your frontal police lobe sorts out and grounds you back into reality, so you can be a regular member of society still. Again, everybody fucking on acid. I mean, that's not the 60s. Like, well, okay, there's a lot to learn there, but a lot of not to do. And everyone does not need to get naked and run around on acid. That is not the solution for the 21st century, in my estimation. So, for a whole host of reasons. But those are beautiful things. And then you say, oh, okay, how do I take the metaphor of what that offered to be grounded and be guided by? Because we're very, very patterned story creatures, and those kinds of metaphorical insights and the experience of them are beautiful pointers toward the sacred. And if we cultivate that and then integrate that with our more regular gross ego states, it's absolutely lots of reasons as to why it's regularly transformed.
Yeah, no, I will say that I definitely went through that arc of optimism, and have had plenty of people I know who had very different outcomes, who did not get drawn into meditation and yoga or insights into the nature of reality. It just, and I think part of that is how you approach it, of course, and who you are and so many things. It's ultimately, I think it's dialectical, right? And that was true of cannabis as well. And that's part of the kind of the immaturity of our culture is this notion of like, oh, have a drug and have an expected relationship.
As if that's a fix, people. That's never the fix. It's tools in a toolbox. There's never an answer. Okay, there's not an answer. All right, to get out of your head that there's an answer to this issue. That's just wrong. That's not the way it works.
Yeah, I really like that framing of like complex adaptive systems. Or basically that the self needs to be understood as a collection of complex interacting processes and what you described, the ideal role of the psychologist or the clinician is to understand what kind of interventions within those complex processes can sustainably like shift the spin on that collection of processes. And that's why the ecstatic experience is great for the rigidity, like opening up, getting a little bit of flexibility in there. But what you do after that, what context you're in, where you go with it, all of these things need to be accounted for. And it's been a real pleasure talking with you today, Greg, and I'm amazed we ended up, we've gone from the tree of knowledge all the way up and ended with the sacred as well. And I think that's something about the resacralization, finding what that is. And as we were doing with the Eden story, like part of the reinventio of the sacred is like
totally
doing it in a meta-modern way where we like can find it for ourselves. For me, like having this whole journey with relationship to Christianity and stuff, but mealtime prayer type, mealtime reflection, mealtime gratitude, all of these different little bits of psychotechnology that we can all, pull from different directions. You want the total absence of suffering of Buddhism sometimes, but then you also need the Petersonian, like pulling between heaven and hell type thing. And
completely.
Also we need like the rational sort of Gregg intervention at certain times as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. No, there's a whole, right. And then I do rational when people are like thinking about killing themselves. I want to lock them down. There are other times when I do psychedelic, right? You want to open up, somebody's over controlled and obsessive compulsive, and you have to understand the head-heart relation. Sometimes you want to open that thing, and sometimes you want to batten down the hatches. So it all depends on what those are all, a proper psychological doctor who knows how to assess and then knows how to see the psychic flow and relations, and then knows how to, get proper coherent integration, or at least, model it and then help the person in the zone of proximal development that they're in relation. So, but yes, I like the way the evolution of our conversation has. I'm big into understanding, and I'm also big into what I call wisdom energy, bringing it back in, and knowing where you're being and becoming in proper relation.
I'm excited for this coming year. I think there's going to be a real explosion of energy in the spring of 2021. And I think that this emergent community of the constellation of communities and thinkers is right where it needs to be to step into that, and each individual stepping up in their own way into whatever is theirs to step into.
That's I do share the the hyper object of whatever is and the future is at the macro level is so hard, for any particular point of view to get a grip on. Sometimes it all depends on my mood as to what I'm actually seeing. I'm a heaven versus hell variety, but I am optimistic. I do feel that there's something happening. I'm certainly feeling my relationship to the planet, what they see my ideas as, the academy didn't give a shit about my ideas, but now all of a sudden there are people that are actually like, oh my God, we actually might need something different. This might not be insane and it might be actually helpful. Would have bunk it, right? But, so that's happening. That's cool. And I really do believe that we are coming, there's awareness of the confusion and the lack of sustainability. And at the very least, I think everybody can agree that we're not reaching our potential relative to our power. Okay? We have an enormous amount of power, but our potential for wise fulfillment is not being realized. Just look at the depression suicide numbers. And then, of course, there's the whole ecology and environment and and God only knows what's happening. So we can certainly do better. I think that we are in the process as we find ourselves we are clearly in an age of confusion, and maybe we're on the cusp of an age of clarity. And if we can yoke together and bring clarity and bring authenticity, connect to our souls, and fill our hungry souls with the proper nourishment, then yeah, maybe.
Well put, Greg. Thanks for coming on Sense Space.
Hey, man, I really appreciate the invite. It was a lot of fun.
Right on.